Marion Whitfield, 41 years old, sat in the gaslit back room of a St. Louis millinery and did a cruel thing to herself with her own 2 hands. She took 3 banknotes out of a drawer. A stock raiser out in Montana Territory had mailed them to her. His fare, the money to bring her west and marry her. She folded them back into the envelope they came in. Then, she took a pin from the cushion at her wrist and pinned the flap shut, so the money could not fall out on its way back to him. She was not crying. That is the part that stays with you. She thought she was being sensible. She had written a sentence to go with it. In her own hand. "I am 41, it said. "I have been ill. You should write to somebody younger." 6 months of letters, and she was the one who ended them, not him. She wrote her own verdict and mailed it back with his money pinned inside. 11 days later, an envelope came the other way. And here is the thing you need to hold on to. It was not an argument. He did not tell her she was wrong. Inside was a railway ticket. A receipt. The fare paid one way, and the fare paid back again. And one line naming a church. And a date. If you have ever ended something yourself, because you were so certain you already knew the answer, this story is for you. Before I go on, do me a small favor. Subscribe, so these stories keep finding you. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let me tell you how it started. Marion Whitfield had made other women's hats for 19 years. She was good at it. Her hands were quick and exact, the kind of hands that could set a spray of silk violets so they looked like they'd grown there. Brides came into that shop, young women with mothers fussing at their elbows, and Marion pinned their veils and never once wore one herself. 19 years of other people's weddings. That was the shape of her life. Useful at the edge of everyone's happiness, and never in the middle of her own. 2 winters back, a fever had gone down into her lungs and stayed there. It left her a cough she couldn't lose. Some mornings she woke, and her chest felt like a wet rag being wrung out. She'd learned to sit up slow and breathe careful and let it pass. She was not dying. Doctor, nobody in particular had told her that. But she was 41, and she coughed, and a woman keeps a ledger in her own head of everything that disqualifies her. In September of 1886, she answered a matrimonial notice. She almost didn't. She read it 4 times standing at the counter with her heart going like a bird against a window. A Gallatin Valley stock raiser wanted a wife. Silas Crane, his name was. The letters he sent were plain, no poetry in them, no flourish. He wrote the way a man talks who is not used to being listened to. He told her about his land and his cattle and the weather, and he asked her honest questions, and he waited for the honest answers. For 6 months, they wrote. A letter took days to cross the country, so a conversation between them was slow, like 2 people talking across a wide field. She learned that he had a sister named Ada who kept his house. She learned he woke before light. She learned he did not lie, even when a lie would have been kinder to himself. And once, in an early letter, he wrote a single line she thought nothing of. She read it and moved right past it. He said, "I had a sister go east once." That was all. He didn't explain it. She didn't ask. It sat in the middle of a paragraph about fencing, and she never thought of it again. Not for a long time. Remember that line. He meant to say more, and didn't, and it will cost them both, later, more than either one can pay. Now, that winter, the one they were riding through, was the worst winter the West had ever seen. They called it the Great Die-Up. You may have heard of it. The cold came down out of Canada and did not lift. Cattle that ranged free on the open grass had nothing to eat under the snow and nowhere to shelter. They drifted into fences and died standing up. When the thaw finally came in the spring, the ranchers rode out and found their herds gone. Whole fortunes lying dead in the coulees. Men who'd been rich in November were ruined by April. Silas Crane lost most of his cattle that winter. He didn't dress it up in his letters. He wrote it plain, the way he wrote everything. He told her the count of what he'd had, and the count of what was left, and the second number was small. And Marion, reading that at her little table by lamplight, did the arithmetic that women like her have been taught to do their whole lives. She added up his losses. She added her own age. She added her cough. And she decided, for both of them, without asking him, that she was one more thing this man could not afford. That's the part I need you to feel. She wasn't being weak. In her mind, she was being strong. She was being realistic. A ruined man out on the frozen edge of the country did not need a sick woman past 40 arriving to be one more mouth, one more worry, one more grave to dig if her lungs gave out. She thought she was saving him. She called it being sensible. So she pinned the money back into the envelope. And she wrote the truest sentence of her life. I am 41. I have been ill. You should write to somebody younger. And she mailed it. She told 2 friends what she'd done, Winifred Poole and Cora Estes. Good women, both. They came to tea, and Marion told them she'd sent the fare back, and both of them set down their cups and told her she'd done right. A woman your age, Cora said, gentle as anything, alone, all the way to Montana, to a stranger, on a dying ranch. Winifred just reached over and patted her hand, which was worse, somehow, than any words. And Marion nodded and felt the sensible thing settle over her like a lid on a jar, and believed the matter was closed. It was not closed. 11 days after she mailed the money back, the envelope from Montana came. It was thicker than his letters usually were. She held it a while before she opened it. She was almost afraid of it. She thought it might be angry, or worse, hurt. It was neither. It was arithmetic. Inside there was a railway ticket for the journey west, and a receipt from the railroad, folded careful, and on the receipt she could see the fare had been paid twice. Once to bring her out, and once to send her home again, whenever she wanted, no questions asked. A return half. The means to leave, and a single line in his plain hand, no argument attached to it, no persuasion. Just the name of a church at Willow Creek, and a date, the 9th of May. That was the whole of it. He did not write that she wasn't too old. He did not tell her 41 was young. He did not flatter her. Not one word. He did not argue with a single thing she'd said about herself, because, she would understand this much later, he did not believe you argue with a person about their own pain. Instead, he had gone into Bozeman and stood at a railroad window and bought a stranger the means to come to him and the means to walk away from him. He answered her refusal not with a speech but with a door that opened both ways, and there was one more thing in the letter, though she barely marked it at the time. He mentioned, plain as the weather, that there was a note held against the range by a bank in Bozeman. Money owed. He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, one fact among others. She read past it. Hold on to that too. That note is going to come due, and when it does it will test everything. She sat with the ticket in her lap for a long time. She turned the return half over and over. And she could not stop thinking one thought, and the thought was this. Every mail-order marriage in the whole country was a trap, and the trap was always the same. The woman got on the train with a one-way fare, and she arrived in a strange place with no money and no way back, and from that first minute she belonged to the man whether he was kind or cruel, because she had no choice left in the world. That was the arrangement. That was how it always worked. And this man had reached into that arrangement and pulled out the one piece that made it a trap. He had bought her the way home before she'd even come. She could not stop turning it over. Of all the men in America who'd placed those notices, why had this one, this plain, ruined stock raiser out on the dead grass, why had he thought about what happened if she said no? She did not know. She would not know for a long time. But the not knowing is a hook, and it went into her, and it held. She had 6 weeks to decide. The 9th of May, she spent them the way she did everything, carefully, turning the ticket like a coin she couldn't spend and couldn't put down. Winifred and Cora came again, and this time they were alarmed. "You're not going," Cora said. It wasn't a question. And Marion said she didn't know, and Winifred said, "Marion, think, a woman your age, alone, to Montana. If it goes wrong, who's there? Who do you call on?" And they weren't wrong. That was the terrible thing. Everything they said was sensible. It was the same sensible that had made her pin the money into the envelope, and for the first time she noticed that the sensible thing and the frightened thing wore the same face. There was one friend who said nothing. Josephine Hale. Josie, she didn't come to tea to argue. She came by one evening, stood in Marion's doorway with her hat still on, and said, "When you go to the depot, I'll drive you. Not if, when," and then she left. That was all. And it was the kindest thing anyone did in all of it, because Josie was the only one who understood that Marion did not need to be talked into her own life. She just needed somebody to hold the reins. The 9th of May came close. Marion packed a trunk, and unpacked it, and packed it again. She put the return half of the ticket where she could reach it, and on the morning she'd decided, Josie was at the door with the wagon, saying nothing, which was exactly what Marion could bear. The St. Louis Depot. I want you to see it, because it's the first time the whole world got to look at what Marion Whitfield was doing, and she felt every eye. The platform was crowded and loud, steam rolling out from under the cars, a man calling destinations through a tin horn. There was an emigrant car near the back, plain benches, meant for people going a long way with little money, and that was Marion's car. Josie carried one end of the trunk, and Marion carried the other, and they set it down, and stood. And there, apart from the crowd, stood Winifred and Cora. They'd come. Not to help her onto the train, to talk her off of it. They stood a little way down the platform with their gloved hands folded, watching her the way you watch someone standing too near the edge of a roof. They didn't come closer. They didn't have to. Their faces did the arguing. Marion looked at them, and she looked at the black mouth of the emigrant car, and her hand went into her glove, where she had tucked the return half of the ticket, folded small against her palm. She could feel the edge of it through the cotton. The way home. Bought and paid for. Hers to use whenever she liked. And somehow that little folded paper was the only thing that let her put her foot on the step. Not because she planned to use it. Because she could. Because for the first time in her life, somebody had handed her a choice that stayed a choice even after she'd made it. The first frost of real fear went through her as she climbed up. Her heart was slamming, but she went up, and she found a seat, and through the window she saw Josie lift one hand, just once, and Winifred and Cora standing still. And then the couplings jerked, and the platform slid backward, and St. Louis began to go away. The going took days. Prairie, then more prairie, then the land started to buckle and rise, and the air out the window got thin and clean and cold even in May. She coughed less, she noticed. The dry air liked her lungs better than the river damp of St. Louis ever had. She kept the return half in her glove the whole way. She slept with it there. Bozeman was a raw little town of board buildings and mud streets under enormous mountains, and on the platform, waiting, was Silas Crane. She knew him, without being told. A big-boned man, weathered, maybe 48, in a coat gone pale at the seams. He was not handsome the way a young girl dreams. He was solid. He held his hat in his hands, and when she came down the step with her cough catching at the cold air, he did not smile a salesman's smile or make a speech. He looked at her a moment. Then he took off his coat, his own coat, off his own back, in the mountain cold, and he held it out to her. and he said the things she would carry the rest of her life. "I got your letter," he said. "I didn't answer it, because it was true, and truth doesn't want arguing with." He paused, working the words out the way a man works a stubborn knot. "The date on the paper binds nothing. The halfback is yours." That was his greeting. No welcome, no how was the journey. He handed her his coat and told her she was free to leave. And in 19 years of pretty words spoken over other women's weddings, Marion Whitfield had never once heard anything as beautiful as those 3 plain sentences from a man who could barely say them. She took the coat. It was warm from him. She put it on. The wagon road out into the Gallatin Valley was long, hours of it, the mountains standing all around like something out of scripture. And when they came at last to the ranch, there was a woman on the porch waiting, and that was Ada, Silas's sister. Plain-spoken, warm, her sleeves already pushed up. She came down the steps and took both of Marion's cold hands in her warm ones and said, "You came." He didn't think you would, and there was so much love packed into that plain little sentence that Marion nearly wept in the yard. The 9th of May was 4 days off when she arrived, and here is a thing that tells you everything about the two of them. Neither one said, "Let's marry on the 9th." Neither one said, "Let's not." The date simply came, and passed, without a word from either of them, by a kind of mutual unspoken agreement that neither was ready and neither would pretend. The paper had said the 9th of May. The paper bound nothing. He'd told her so on the platform. So the day went by like any other day, and Marion stayed on, not as a wife, not exactly as a guest, but as something with no name yet, in a house on a ranch that the winter had nearly killed. 4 valley months opened in front of her, unmarked, unpromised, and hers to fill. She started to be useful. She couldn't help it. It was how she was built. And the first thing she was useful for was the ledger. The die-up had wrecked more than the herd. It had wrecked Silas's books. He was a good rancher and a poor bookkeeper, and after the winter his accounts were a mess of scratched-out figures and cattle that were counted alive, that were dead, and money owed in 3 directions. Marion, whose milliner's hands had kept exact accounts of ribbon and buckram and silk for 19 years, sat down at his table one evening, with the whole ruined ledger and a fresh candle. And she took it apart and put it back together. Every figure. She found errors that had been costing him. She made the numbers tell the truth. When Silas came in and saw what she'd done, he stood over the book a long while. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man who said much. But something changed in the way he looked at her. That was the first degree of it. The first small turn of trust. He had brought her out for a wife and found, instead, first, a mind that could save his land. And that was worth more to him just then than any wife. The heifer came a few weeks after. One of the few good breeding animals left after the winter went down sick in the night, bloated and groaning in the low barn. If she died, it was one more loss the ranch couldn't take. Silas was up with her, and Ada, and then Marion came out in the dark in Ada's borrowed coat and stayed. All night. The 3 of them worked over that animal by lantern light, and somewhere past midnight Ada went into sleep, and it was just Silas and Marion and the sick heifer and the cold. They talked, a little, the way people do at 3 in the morning when they're too tired to guard themselves. And near dawn, when the danger had passed and the heifer heaved herself up onto her feet, Ada brought out coffee and set the sugar bowl on the barn shelf, and Marion waved it off. She took hers black. She always had. It was nothing. She didn't even mark it. But Silas marked it. And from that morning on, when there was coffee, the sugar simply wasn't set out near her place anymore. He never said a word about it. He never made it a thing. He just noticed what she was, and quietly arranged the small world of the table around the truth of her. A woman who has spent her whole life being the one who notices, and never the one noticed, will tell you, that is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. Then, The bank letter came. It was a gray morning. A rider brought the mail out from Bozeman, and among it was an envelope from the Merchants and Drovers Bank, and Silas opened it at the table and read it and set it down and said nothing. Mr. Halloran, the bank officer, had posted the note formal, the money owed against the range, the note that had ridden quiet in the background of everything, it was called. $1,140. Due by the June roundup. Pay it, or the bank would take the range. $1,140 on a ranch the winter had already stripped to the bone. Silas read it and folded it and put it in his shirt and went out to work, because that's what he did with everything. And breakfast sat on the table. And Ada ate, worried but eating, and Marion watched Silas's plate. And she was the only one at that table who saw that he did not touch his food. Not a bite. He'd folded the whole weight of losing his land into his shirt pocket and walked out to his chores, and the only sign of it in all the world was a plate of eggs going cold, and she was the one person who noticed it was cold. Nobody else saw. She saw, and she said nothing, because she understood him now well enough to know that saying something would only take from him the one dignity he had left, which was pretending he could carry it alone. But she couldn't leave it alone either. She wasn't built to stand at the edge of trouble and watch. So she did the thing her whole life had trained her to do. She went back to what her hands knew. She took the good silk and buckram she'd brought in her trunk, the tools of her old trade, and she began to make hats. Real ones. The kind she'd made for St. Louis brides. And she carried the first few into Bozeman, into the little dry goods and the dressmakers, and she showed them to the shopwomen there. Women out on the raw frontier who had not seen a properly trimmed hat in years and hungered for one more than they'd admit. And they bought them. And they wanted more. Word went around the shop counters of Bozeman that there was a woman out in the Gallatin who could make a hat like they made back east, and orders came, and Marion sat up nights trimming and stitching, turning her 19 years of other women's weddings into dollars. Real dollars. Toward the note. Her old life, that she'd thought she was leaving behind on the platform in St. Louis, it turned out to be worth something out here after all. It turned out to be part of how she'd saved the place, and her lungs held. Mostly, there was one bad week when the cough came back hard, and Ada sent for Dr. Merritt, the valley physician, a practical man with no theater in him. He listened to her chest and asked plain questions and told her plainly. The dry mountain air was better for her than St. Louis had ever been. She was not to overdo it, she was to rest when it came on. And that was all. No hovering, no dark warnings, no treating her like something breakable. He handled her illness the way Silas handled everything, as a fact to be managed, not a tragedy to be mourned. And Marion, who had spent 2 years being a woman with weak lungs, got to be in the Gallatin just a woman who rested when she needed to. That was its own kind of medicine. The June roundup came on. That was the week the whole valley moved, gathering what stock the winter had left, driving and counting and sorting, the week that would decide whether Silas had enough to sell to meet Halloran's note or not. And it was, though nobody said it out loud, the week Marion Whitfield made the largest decision of her life. And she made it the way Silas had taught her a decision could be made, not with a speech, with an act. She had the return half of the ticket. She'd kept it all along, in the glove, then in a small box in her room. The way home. Bought and paid for. Silas had told her on the platform it was hers, and it still was. She could have taken the money she'd earned trimming hats and bought her passage and gone. She could have added her own savings to the return half and left the valley clean, no debt, no cough for anyone to worry over. Her sensible self proven right. Instead, she took the money she'd earned with her own hands, every dollar of it, and she put it toward Silas's note. She staked herself to the place. Not with a wedding, not with a vow, not with a single word spoken out loud. With money. With a choice you couldn't unmake, laid down in the middle of Roundup week. She had spent her way home into keeping a ruined man's land. She still had the return half in the box. But the earnings that could have carried her back to St. Louis were gone now into the Gallatin ground, and there was no getting them out again. She didn't tell anyone she'd done it, exactly, but Silas knew what her hats had brought in. And when the note came to be reckoned and the figures were counted, her money was in it, woven right through it. And there was no way for either of them to pretend, after that she was only passing through. She had chosen. In an act, not a word. The way he did everything. What she did not know, what neither of them had said, what sat locked and face down and unspoken somewhere out in that barn, in a trunk nobody opened and a name nobody said, was why. Why this man, of all of them? Why the fare both ways? Why he'd counted, before he ever met her, the exact cost of a woman who arrives somewhere with no way back home. There was a reason. There was one line in an old letter, "I had a sister go east once," and there was a locked eastbound trunk up in the barn loft, and a photograph turned face to the wall, and a name that had not been spoken in that valley in 8 years. And it was coming. Whether Marion was ready or not, that locked door was going to open. And when it did, everything she thought she understood about the ticket in her box was going to turn out to mean something else entirely. The note came due the week of the June roundup, and Marion was there when it was reckoned. They rode into Bozeman together on the wagon seat, her books in a satchel on her lap. Silas had wanted to go alone. She had said no. Not loudly. She had simply climbed up beside him and set the satchel down and looked straight ahead at the horses, and after a while he shook the lines and they went. Mr. Halloran kept his office at the back of the Merchants and Drovers Bank, past the tellers, behind a door of frosted glass. He was a spare man with ink on his cuff. He had called the note. He had every right to. The winter had killed half the cattle in the valley, and a bank does not run on sympathy. He looked at Silas first. He always did. Then Marion opened the satchel and set the ledger on his desk, turned so he could read it, and put her finger on the line where the figures came right. $1,140, she said. Here is where it stands. Here is the stock sold at Bozeman this spring, by weight, at the price the drovers got. Here is what my hats brought in. And here, she turned a page, is what the range will carry through winter if you let it stand one more season. Halloran read. He was slow about it. He read the way a man reads who is looking for the mistake and cannot find it. You kept these? He asked her. I kept them. They're clean. They're clean because they're true, she said. There's nothing in them that didn't happen. He set the ledger down. He looked at Silas, and then he looked, longer, at Marion. I'll extend it, he said. On the books. Not on the man. On the books. He signed something and slid it across the desk. You've a good hand, Mrs. Crane. She did not correct him on the name. Silas did not either. They let it lie there on the desk between them, that name, and they took the paper and went out through the frosted door and past the tellers and into the June light. He handed her up onto the wagon seat. He walked around to his own side, and before he took up the lines he said, quiet, not looking at her, You didn't have to put your hats in it. I know, she said. It's a debt now. Yours in it. I know that too. He clicked to the horses. That was all he said. But halfway home, where the road bent along Willow Creek and the cottonwoods threw shade across the ruts, he stopped the team to let them blow, and he sat there a moment with his hands loose on his knees, and he said, to the horses more than to her, nobody ever staked me before. Not with their own money, not without asking me to marry them first. She looked at the water. I didn't ask you anything, she said. No, he said. You didn't. And there was something in the way he said it that was almost the thing he could not say, and they both heard it, and neither one of them turned to look. The valley decided they were married. Nobody had seen a wedding, but the 9th of May had come and gone, and there was a woman keeping the books and selling hats in Bozeman and riding in on the seat beside Silas Crane. And that was enough for the valley. The shopwomen called her Mrs. Crane, Dr. Merritt. When he came out to listen to her chest and tell her the dry air was doing what the river damp never could, called her Mrs. Crane, she let it stand. It was easier than the truth, which was that she still had the return half of a railway ticket folded in a small box in her room, and that no vow had been spoken, and that she did not know, from one week to the next, what she was. The summer went by in small things. He learned she took her coffee black. He had set the sugar out every morning for weeks, the little cracked bowl of it, and every morning she left it, and one morning it simply wasn't there. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it, but the bowl was gone off the table, and that was a whole sentence, spoken without a word, and she read it clean. There was a heifer that went down in July, sick and swollen, and they sat up with it in the barn all night, the two of them, by lantern light. He showed her how to work the animal's legs, how to keep it from bloating, how to get water into it. Somewhere past midnight, she stopped being cold and stopped being tired and was just there, in the straw, beside a man who did not talk, working to save a thing that was probably going to die. It didn't die. Toward dawn it heaved up onto its legs and stood there swaying and stupid and alive, and Silas looked at it, and then he looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved. That was his whole smile. She had learned to read that too. In August, he mended the depot bench. She hadn't asked him to. She rode into Willow Creek to wait for the mail on Thursdays, because the shopwomen sent their hat orders by post, and the bench on the platform had a broken slat that caught her skirt. She had said nothing about it, but one Thursday she came, and the slat was new, planed smooth, sanded, the nailhead sunk. Nobody at the depot knew who'd done it. She knew. He'd have done it early, before anyone was about, so that no one would see and no one could thank him. She sat on the mended bench and waited for the mail, and did not know whether she wanted to laugh or put her face in her hands, and she did a little of both, quietly, where the station master couldn't see. On the cold mornings, coming home in the wagon, he took off his coat and laid it over her knees. Never a word. He'd just shrug out of it and drop it across her lap and take up the lines and drive, sitting there in his shirt sleeves in the September chill, like a man who felt nothing. She stopped protesting after the second time. It was another sentence. She was learning his whole language, and it was a language with no words in it, only acts, and she was fluent now in a way she had never been fluent in the spoken kind. She was happy. That was the thing that frightened her. She caught herself humming, trimming a hat by the window. She caught herself watching the road in the afternoon for the shape of him coming in from the range. She had gone 41 years being useful and sensible and unchosen, and now she was none of those things. She was simply glad. Glad the way you are glad as a girl before you learn better, and it terrified her. Because she knew what she was. She knew what her lungs were. She knew that gladness, in a woman her age, with a cough 2 winters deep, was a loan that would be called. And in the 4th Valley month, it was called. The cold came down off the mountains early that year. It got into her chest the way it always had, only worse, and one morning she woke and could not get a full breath, and the fever was in her. And she lay there in the gray light and listened to Silas moving in the kitchen, quiet, so as not to wake her. And she understood exactly what was going to happen next. She was going to be a sick wife, a burden. A woman he had to nurse and pay a doctor for and sit up nights with, the way they'd sat up with the heifer, only she would not heave up onto her legs at dawn and stand there alive. She had written him a letter once. She had written the truest sentence of her life. I am 41, I have been ill. You should write to somebody younger. And she had been right. She had been right all along, and here was the proof of it, come to collect. So she did the sensible thing. She did the thing she had spent her whole life calling realism. She got up while the fever let her. She packed what she'd come with. And she took the small box off the shelf, and she opened it, and she took out the return half of the railway ticket, the one he'd paid for, the one that had sat unused since May, and she put it in her glove, the way she had carried it out of St. Louis, and she walked out to the road while he was down at the barn, and she started for the Willow Creek Depot to go home with dignity, before she cost him anything more. It was a long walk with a fever in her. She made it. The eastbound wasn't in yet. She sat down on the bench he had mended, the smooth new slat under her hand, and she waited to leave. He found her there. She heard the wagon before she saw it. She heard it stop. She did not turn. She heard his boots on the platform, unhurried, the way he did everything, and then he was standing in front of her, hat in his hand, and he did not reach for her, and he did not reach for the ticket in her glove. He just stood. "You'll want to sit," she said. Her voice came out thin. "It's a cold wait." "I'll stand," he said. "Silas, you don't have to say it," he said. "I know what it says. It's the same thing your letter said." He turned his hat in his hands. "I am 41. I have been ill. Write to somebody younger." He looked at her. "You memorized it too." She couldn't answer that. "I told you at the start," he said. "Your letter was true, and truth doesn't want arguing with. I'm not going to argue with it now." He was quiet a moment. Down the track, the signal arm was still up. No train. "But I'll tell you a thing I've never told anybody in this valley. And then you can get on the cars if you want to. I won't stop you. I've never once stopped you." She sat still. The ticket was in her glove. Her hand was around it. "I had a sister," he said. "Older than Ada. Hannah," he said the name carefully, the way you'd set down something you'd carried a long way. "You'll have seen the photograph turned to the wall. That's her. Nobody said her name in this valley in 8 years. I haven't said it. Ada won't. There's a trunk of hers up in the barn loft, locked, packed for a journey east, and it's sat there packed for near 10 years now, because it never went." The signal arm hung in the cold air. Marion did not move. "In '79, Hannah answered a notice," Silas said. "Same as you did. A man in Ohio, letters, all of it. And she went east to him, and it soured. I never got the whole of it. She wasn't one to write her troubles, and by the time it soured, she had no way back. No fare. He wouldn't give her one, and she was too proud to ask us, and too far to walk." His jaw worked. "She wrote once that she'd come home when she could manage it. She never could manage it. She died there. Back east. 2,000 miles from this loft where her trunk's been sitting packed the whole time, waiting on a journey nobody bought her the ticket for." Marion's hand had gone loose around the ticket. "That's why," he said. "That's the whole of it. When I sent your fare, I sent it both ways because I sat down and I counted the cost of a woman who comes somewhere on a man's say-so and then can't get home if she wants to. I counted it because I know what it costs. It cost me a sister." He put his hat back on. "It wasn't chivalry. Chivalry never entered into it. I paid the fare home because I'd already paid, once, for not thinking to, and I swore I'd never let another woman get on a train to me with no way off it." The eastbound whistle sounded, far down the valley. A thin, far sound. "So there it is," Silas said. "You've got the fare. It's yours, like I told you the day you came. The half back is yours. I bought it so you could go. I meant it then, and I mean it now. If you get on those cars, I'll drive home and I won't say a word against it, because a woman ought to be able to leave. That's the whole reason I ever thought of it." He stepped back. He gave her the room. "But I'd rather you knew why the ticket cost what it cost before you spent it." The train came in. It came in loud, the way they do, brakes and steam and the platform shaking, and the doors opened, and a porter called down the line, and Marion sat on the mended bench with the return half loose in her gloved hand, and the whole thing turned over in her at last. All of it. Everything she thought she'd understood about that ticket turning out to mean something else entirely. She had thought it was courtesy, a gentleman's gesture, the polite thing a decent man does, pay both ways, so the lady isn't stranded. She had studied it in St. Louis like arithmetic and thought she'd solved it. She had solved nothing. It was not courtesy. It was a man who had counted, in real money, the exact price of a woman with no way back home, because he had once failed to count it, and it had killed his sister. The whole of his silence, she saw it now. 8 years of a name unsaid. A trunk packed and locked. A photograph turned to the wall. He did not believe silence was a way of not grieving. He believed it was the same as having grieved. He was wrong about that, plainly wrong, and it had cost him 8 years, and he had just spent all 8 of them, out loud, on a cold platform, to a woman with a fever, so that she would know what she held in her hand before she used it. The porter called again. Bored, Marion stood up off the bench. She was unsteady with the fever, and she let herself be unsteady. She took the return half out of her glove. She looked at it, the paper soft now from being carried, the print worn at the fold, and Silas watched her hold it, and he did not reach for it, and he did not reach for her. He let her hold both things at once, the leaving and the staying. He let her decide. She put the ticket back in her glove. She turned from the track. "Take me home," she said. "I'm cold. And you're standing there in your shirt sleeves like a fool with the coat still in the wagon." Something went across his face that she had never seen go across it, not even the night the heifer stood up. He didn't smile. It was bigger than a smile and quieter. He picked up her bag off the platform. The eastbound pulled out behind them without her on it, and neither of them turned to watch it go. They were married at the Willow Creek Methodist Church in September, 4 months after the date on the paper he'd sent her. It was a plain wedding. The light came in low and gold through the west windows, the way it does in the valley in September, and the church was full, which surprised her, because she had thought of herself, all her life, as a woman nobody would fill a church for. Ada sat in the front pew. Ada, who had waited at the ranch the day Marion came, and had said, plain, that Marion had come when Silas never thought she would. Ada wept the whole way through, and made no apology for it, a big plain woman crying into a handkerchief in the front pew, glad clear down to the ground that her brother would not be alone. The Bozeman shopwomen came. They came in a row, and every one of them wore a hat that Marion's own hands had trimmed, the good silk and buckram out of the trunk she'd carried west, turned into a dozen hats sold across a counter to raise a piece of a banknote. They wore them like a banner. They had not known her a year, and they came in her hats to see her married. The drovers came. The men whose herd her clean books had helped carry through, who'd have lost the range to Halloran if the figures hadn't come right. They stood at the back with their hats in their hands, awkward in a church, and stayed to the end. Dr. Merritt came, the man who had listened to her chest and told her, without drama, that the dry air was mending what the river never would. He gave her a small nod when she came in on Silas's arm, a doctor's nod, a man confirming his own prescription. And Silas said the plainest vows a man ever said. He was not eloquent. He never became eloquent. He stood there 48 years old with his hands too big for the day, and said the words the minister gave him to say and not one word more, and that was right. That was exactly right, because she would not have believed him if he'd suddenly turned eloquent. She had married the man with no words in his mouth and only acts in his hands, and she wanted no other. Word came from St. Louis in the weeks after. Cora Estes wrote a short, stiff note. It congratulated her. It hoped she was well. It was the note of a friend who had said, "Don't go." A woman your age, alone, to Montana, and had been proved wrong, and did not quite know how to say so, and so said very little. Marion read it and forgave it, and set it aside. Josie wrote too. Josephine Hale, who had driven her to the depot in St. Louis without one word of argument, who had said only when you go, not if. Josie's letter was longer and warmer, and it said at the bottom, "I knew the morning I drove you." I couldn't have told you how I knew, but I knew you weren't coming back, and I was glad, and I've been glad every day since. Marion kept that one. She did not tear up the return half. That was the last thing, and the hardest to explain, and she never did explain it to anyone for a long time. She could have torn it up. A woman who means to stay tears up the ticket home. That would have been the grand thing to do. The thing in a story. She didn't do the thing in a story. She folded the return half, the worn soft paper, along its old fold, and she put it in a tin, a little tin that had held tea, and she set the tin on the shelf. Because to tear it up would be to say she couldn't leave. And to keep it, unused, forever, was to say something better. It was to say she could leave. The fare was there. The way home was paid and open every single day, and she stayed anyway. Every morning she didn't use it was a morning she chose. The ticket wasn't her trap. It was her vow, renewed, unspoken. The only kind of vow either of them had ever trusted. 9 years on, in the spring of 1896, on the anniversary of the day she'd stepped off the cars at Bozeman, Marion took the tin down off the shelf in the ranch kitchen and opened it, and showed the return half to exactly one person. She showed it to Silas. He was grayer. The range had come back, the herd rebuilt, the note long since paid clean, and the ledger square for years. He sat at the table where he'd once had a ruined ledger and a called note and a photograph turned to the wall. The photograph was turned around now, Hannah's face to the room, had been for years, and Marion set the tin in front of him and took out the soft worn ticket and put it in his hand. "I've kept it all this time," she said. "You never asked why." "No," he said. "I never did." "I kept it," she said, "because it was the first honest thing anybody ever handed me. Every man I ever knew told me what I wanted to hear. You handed me the fare home and let me go. That's the only honest thing anyone ever did about me, and I wasn't going to throw it out." Silas looked at the ticket in his hand for a long time. He was not eloquent. He was never going to be eloquent. He didn't try. He just closed the tin lid gently over the ticket she'd laid back inside, and he put his hand flat on top of the tin and left it there, warm and heavy, and that was the whole of what he had to say, and it was enough. It had always been enough. He's some years gone now. As I tell you this, it's 1918. I'm past 70. The kitchen's the same kitchen. There's a young woman boards here, and this morning I found her at that table with 3 banknotes and an envelope and a pin, folding the money back to send it home to a man out in Oregon who'd asked her to come and marry him. Writing him that she wouldn't. "Too plain," she said. "Too poor. Tell him to ask somebody better." I know that letter. I wrote it myself once, in a gaslit back room in St. Louis, 41 years old, 3 banknotes, a pin off my wrist cushion to seal it shut. I disqualified myself, and I called it being sensible. So, I took down the tin. I set it on the table between us. I opened it, and I showed her the return half of a railway ticket, worn soft, more than 30 years old now, never used. I didn't tell her he loved me. That's not the thing. That's not the test. I told her this. In 6 months of letters, he was the only man who thought about what happened to me if I said no. Every other man in the world will pay your fare to come to him. He paid the fare there, and the fare home both, and then he stepped back on a cold platform and let me choose which one to spend. And I told her the only thing about generosity worth knowing. Generosity is only worth what it costs the giver if you refuse it. Anybody will spend on you when they're getting you in the bargain. He spent on my leaving. He bought me the way out, and meant it. That's the whole of it. That is the whole of the thing. She's still at the table, the pin's still in her hand. I don't know yet what she'll do. I never did tell anyone how it comes out. You decide a thing like that yourself, at a table, with the fare in your glove. She wrote that she would not come. He sent the fare there, and the fare back, and let her choose. That's the story. That's all of it. If you've ever ended something yourself because you were so sure of the answer, comment the city you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this one traveled.